Thank you all again for joining. I'm excited to get things kicked off. We have what's sure to be an exciting hour of what will be a very valuable session on a very real and relevant topic, one that is affecting each and every one of us at some level. Why are we here today? Our objective here today is no secret. We're here to raise awareness, answer some questions, eliminate confusion, and to inform you all to the best of our ability with some critical information that, as a manufacturing community, will help us understand the gameplay and resolve some challenges tied to what is needed to safely and effectively cross the border to conduct essential business during the COVID-19 pandemic. So to our members, we've heard you loud and clear. And today's session is yet another example of how the community of Windsor-Essex pulls together when it's most needed. Today's webinar has been sponsored by the Windsor-Essex Economic Development Corporation, the Canadian Association of Mold Makers, CAM, Automate Canada, the Canadian Tooling and Machining Association, CTMA, and the Canadian Consulate General's Office of Detroit. Special thanks to Susan Anslin and the rest of the WindsorEssex team for keeping things so well organized as we get started. Many of us here today are manufacturers and exporting manufacturers at that. The need to maintain and cultivate a healthy integrated cross-border supply chain needs no introduction. The cross-border challenges we are dealing with highlights the importance of this session exactly to Canada and of course to the United States. We are very much looking forward to hearing from the CBSA today on essentially what we can do to move people effectively for the sake of our economies. So before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. Today we'll follow a typical format that we've seen in the past where all participants can pose questions during the session by using the Q&A function in the chat box. Given the high number of attendees today, our facilitator has turned the audio and video functions off from the audience. So keep your comments and questions into the chat box, please. Also, as an FYI to all, we are recording this session. So, as I stated earlier, this is going to be a great session. I'd like to introduce our two CBSA officials. First, we have Bonnie began her career with the Federal Public Service in 2002 as an immigration officer with Citizenship and Immigration Canada. In 2006, she became a superintendent with the Canada Border Services Agency and chief of operations in 2014. During that time, she's worked at both the Windsor Tunnel and Ambassador Bridge locations, and has been responsible for the immigration portfolios at each. Second, we have began his career with the Federal Public Service in 1998 as a customs officer with Canada Customs. In 2006, he then became a superintendent with the Canada Border Services Agency and chief of operations in 2015. During that time, he has worked at both the Windsor Tunnel and Ambassador Bridge locations and has been the regional commercial program manager for the Southern Ontario region since 2019. He is currently the acting director at the Windsor Tunnel. For the formatting of today's event, we'll let Bonnie and Eric present. I believe Eric is going to start us off first, through until right around the 12 o'clock, 12:05 timeframe, and then we'll switch over to the Q&A portion, which will be moderated by Shelley Fellows, who's the chair of Automate Canada, and she'll be taking it over at that point. So enough from me at this point.
I'd like to thank everyone for having us today, and hopefully you'll find the information we are sharing with you helpful. As you're all aware, these are unprecedented times, and the public health is our top priority. CBSA's mandate is to provide integrated border services that support national security and public safety priorities while facilitating the free flow of legitimate trade and travel. That is our goal as we navigate these ever-changing times. So as part of our discussion today, we're going to be discussing mandatory quarantine and isolation, what exemptions exist, what constitutes essential travel, and what one can expect when crossing the border. And just so everybody knows, we have to use our personal devices today because we can't use Zoom on government computers. So we are hoping that that goes off with too much of a hitch. But at this point, I will turn it over to my colleague to start us off.
Okay, can we have slide number 1 on the screen? Okay, so there were some questions initially about the difference between isolation and quarantine. So we wanted to make sure we were able to give you a definition as to what that difference is. So isolation means the separation of persons who have COVID-19 or who have signs and symptoms of COVID-19 from others in such a manner as to prevent the spread of the disease. Quarantine is the separation of persons from others in such a manner to prevent the possible spread of disease. So when we talk about self-isolation, it's because somebody's displaying signs and symptoms or has been diagnosed with the disease. When we talk about self-quarantine, it's just separating oneself from others to prevent the spread. So all persons entering Canada are required to quarantine for a period of 14 days unless an exemption exists. We will go over the exemptions in just a moment. Those who meet an exemption are expected to self-monitor for any signs and symptoms of COVID-19. What they mean by self-monitor is you should be paying attention to how you feel. Do you have a fever? Do you have a cough? Do you have any of the signs and symptoms that have been identified as being related to COVID-19? And if that is the case, then you should be contacting a medical professional, which may put you in an isolation situation. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act actually added a new paragraph, which is 183(1)D, which is a new mandatory condition that is automatically imposed on any foreign national who is authorized to enter Canada as a temporary resident, to comply with the requirements imposed on them under an order or regulation made under the Emergencies Act or Quarantine Act. So that was added to ensure that the mandatory conditions imposed on the foreign nationals and the temporary residents were adhered to. So when it comes to mandatory quarantine, any person who enters Canada and who does not have signs and symptoms of COVID-19 must quarantine themselves without delay in accordance with the instructions provided by a screening officer or quarantine officer and remain in quarantine until the expiry of the 14-day period that begins on the day in which the person enters Canada. In that situation, travelers must quarantine in a place where they will have no contact with vulnerable people, such as people 65 years or older, or people who have underlying medical conditions. They have to confirm that they have a suitable place to isolate, where they will have access to basic necessities, such as food and medication, and wear a non-surgical mask or face covering while traveling to the place of quarantine. At that time, they are expected to monitor for signs and symptoms of COVID-19 until the expiry of the 14-day period. And if they develop signs and symptoms of COVID-19, they are expected to follow instructions provided by public health authority specified by a screening officer or a quarantine officer. In order to comply with the requirements of mandatory quarantine, the expectation is that you go directly to a place of quarantine without stopping anywhere and stay there for 14 days. Do not go to school, work, or other public areas and community settings. Monitor your health for symptoms of COVID-19. Arrange to have someone pick up essentials like groceries or medication. Do not have visitors. Stay in a private place like your yard or your balcony if you go outside for fresh air, and keep a distance of at least 2 arms length, approximately 2 meters from others. When you're monitoring for symptoms such as fever, cough, difficulty breathing, anything that has been identified as an identifiable sign or symptom for COVID-19. If you start experiencing symptoms of COVID-19, cough, shortness of breath, a fever equal or greater to 38 degrees, or signs of a fever, shivering, flushed skin, excessive sweating, at that point, you are expected to isolate from others and contact your local public health authority and follow the instructions. The 14-day period again, if during the quarantine period you develop any signs and symptoms of COVID-19. Can we get slide number 2, please? Now, there are exemptions, group exemptions that have been made with regards to who is exempt from that mandatory quarantine. We're putting it on the screen as I know it's very detailed and involved. I'm going to read it over, but you will have access to this as well. So the group exemptions have been made to the mandatory quarantine as determined by the Chief Public Health Officer under Section 6E of the Order in Council. At this time, the following class of persons are exempt from the mandatory quarantine requirement. Persons in trade or transportation sector who are important for the movement of goods or people, including truck drivers and crew members on any aircraft, shipping vessel, or train, and that cross the border while performing their duties or for the purpose of performing their duties. Persons who must cross the border regularly to go to their normal place of employment, including critical infrastructure workers, energy and utilities, information and communication technologies, finance, health, food, water, transportation, safety, government, and manufacturing, provided they do not directly care for persons 65 years of age or older within the first 14 days after their entry to Canada. Regularly generally means that the person is required to cross the border daily or weekly, as opposed to sporadically or quarterly. Technicians or specialists specified by a government, manufacturer, or company who enter Canada as required for the purpose of maintaining, repairing, installing, or inspecting equipment necessary to support critical infrastructure, energy and utilities, information and communication, technologies, finance, health, food, water, transportation, safety, government, and manufacturing, and are required to provide their services within 14 days of their entry to Canada and have a reasonable rationale for the immediacy of the work and the inability to plan for the 14-day quarantine. I think that one is really a big one when it comes to some of the questions we saw coming forward. Is you may be required to quarantine, but if you can demonstrate why the immediacy needs to happen within that 14 days, there are considerations and exemptions to happen. Persons including a captain, deckhand, observer, inspector, scientist, veterinarian, and other persons supporting commercial or research, open water, aquaculture related activities who enter Canada for the purpose of carrying out aquaculture activities, who enter Canada for the purpose of carrying out aquaculture related activities, including fishing, transporting fish to and from the aquaculture facility, treating fish or pests or pathogens, repairs, provisions of aquaculture related vessels or aquaculture facilities or exchange of crew, and who proceed directly to an open water facility or vessel upon entry to Canada are exempt. And emergency service providers, including firefighters, peace officers, and paramedics who return from providing such services in another country and are required to provide their services within 14 days of the return to Canada, and commercial conveyances, operators, and repatriating human remains into Canada. So while an exemption from quarantine may be granted under the Federal Order in Council, you always need to consult the provincial and territorial resources for any additional restrictions regarding mandatory quarantine, as stricter measures may apply in different provinces or territories. There will be Public Health Agency Canada information shown later in this presentation. So if you do want to ask questions about the mandatory quarantine or about an exemption from that quarantine, we will have that information for you a little bit later. And as a note, travelers are only exempt from the requirement to quarantine within the context of the exemptions based on the purpose of travel and not simply because of a position they hold. So if somebody holds a position in a company that would meet the exemptions, but is not going to the United States or not entering Canada, for that reason, they will not be exempt from that quarantine. As a note, a foreign national is prohibited from entering Canada from the United States if they have COVID-19 or have signs and symptoms of COVID-19. So a fever and cough or fever and breathing difficulties. So if somebody is coming in from the United States or abroad and they are showing signs and symptoms of COVID-19, they will not be allowed to enter. If a foreign national seeks to enter for an optional or discretionary purpose, unless they are an immediate family member of a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, they are also prohibited from entering Canada. So you cannot enter Canada for optional or discretionary purposes at this time, unless you meet an exemption of immediate family member, which will again be discussed later in the presentation. So can we have slide number 3, please? So I would say everybody on this call is probably very familiar with the business visitor requirements. Not much has changed there. What I will say is letters of introduction that include why this person's presence in Canada is essential is definitely something that should be accompanying every foreign national attempting to enter Canada. If more information at this point is better, so anything that you can provide to make the case to provide an officer with what they need to make their decision is ideal. So business visitor requirements, there must be no intent to enter the Canadian labor market, no gainful employment from an employer in Canada. The activity of the foreign national must be international in scope. Therefore, there's the presumption of underlying cross-border business activity, example, after-sales service. There is the presumption of a foreign employer. So the primary source of the worker's remuneration remains outside of Canada, and the principal place of business of the worker's employer is located outside of Canada, and the accrual of profits of the worker's employer is located outside of Canada. Business visitors should have all relevant documents on hand to present to the officer when seeking entry to Canada, including letters of support from the business visitor's parent company and a letter of invitation from the Canadian host company. None of that has changed. That's always been the expectation when it comes to business visitors. What has changed now is documentation should support the essential nature of the work or exemption to the prohibition of entry for foreign nationals. As examples, work related to commerce, trade, economic services, and supply chains and critical infrastructure support would generally be considered non-discretionary activities. So this is where you want to ensure you are outlining and clearly stating that the work these people are coming to perform is essential in nature and it is non-discretionary. Travelers may also be required to provide evidence of suitable quarantine measures, if not otherwise exempt from the mandatory 14-day quarantine, as discussed earlier. So, as mentioned, somebody may be allowed entry into Canada because the work they are doing is essential. But if they don't meet the exemptions outlined earlier, they are still required to have the mandatory 14-day quarantine. The onus is on the foreign national to demonstrate the purpose of their travel. A border services officer will make the final determination on the foreign national's eligibility to enter Canada at the port of entry. Okay, and I'm going to turn it over to Eric Beck.
Hey, thanks, Bonnie. Okay, so I'll discuss a little bit about the topic of face masks and coverings. All travelers must wear non-medical masks or face covering upon arrival in Canada, as well as when leaving the country if leaving before the period of mandatory quarantine has been completed. So we do have an ample supply at the border. So if anybody does cross without a face covering, we are able to supply that to them. We've put packages together that has a lot of information. There's information sheets from the Public Health Agency along with the medical masks. So every person who enters Canada and who is not required to quarantine themselves must, during the 14-day period that begins on the day on which they enter Canada, if they're in public settings where physical distancing cannot be maintained, wear a non-medical mask or face covering. So persons exempt from mandatory quarantine are still required to wear an appropriate mask or face covering upon entry into Canada while in transit, and if they are in public settings where physical distancing cannot be maintained, and respect the public health guidance and instructions of the area where you are traveling and prevention measures from your workplace. I'll move on to the collection of contact information. This is something new for all of us. The provision of contact information by travelers seeking entry is mandatory under the Quarantine Act. Under the Quarantine Act, our border services officers are designated as screening officers under that act. So this information is collected by border services officers on behalf of the Public Health Agency of Canada to support their compliance and enforcement of the 14-day quarantine or isolation requirement outlined in the mandatory isolation order. So Section 2 of the Order in Council, minimizing the risk of exposure to COVID-19 in Canada, which deals with mandatory isolation, provides the authority for border services officers in their role as screening officers, as well as quarantine officers and public health officials to request this information, and states the following. Every person who enters Canada must answer any relevant questions asked by a screening officer, quarantine officer, or public health official designated under Section 2.1, or asked on behalf of the Chief Public Health Officer for the purposes of the administration of his order, and provide any information or record in the person's possession that the officer, official, or Chief Public Health Officer requires. Asymptomatic travelers have a variety of ways to submit their contact information, including we have an ArriveCAN mobile application, which reduces wait times and limits contact at the port of entry. It's important to note that if people are using that the ArriveCAN application, if they use it, they need to use it each and every time they cross the border. If they don't use that app when people cross the border, our system is integrated with the Public Health Agency. There's an application that we have where the first time we enter that information, it self-populates on every other subsequent crossing. So we find that's the easiest way of doing it, but we do suggest the ArriveCAN if possible. They can also use a paper-based PHAC coronavirus form or the online PHAC coronavirus form. I want to note importantly that starting tomorrow, collection of this information will begin at all port of entries across Canada for essential workers. So up till now, only essential workers were exempt from this requirement, and we weren't collecting that information. So this new program had started at some of the smaller ports, which include the Windsor Tunnel, a couple of weeks ago, and it's gone off without too many issues. And the larger ports, such as the Ambassador Bridge, are coming online with that tomorrow. So that is an important thing to note. So the penalties for non-compliance: violating any instructions provided to you when entering Canada is an offence under the Quarantine Act, and could lead up to 6 months in prison and or $750,000 in fines. Further, a person who causes a risk of imminent death or serious bodily harm to another person while willfully or recklessly contravening this act or the regulations could be liable for a fine of up to $1 million or imprisonment of up to 3 years, or both. Gina, if we could get slide 4, please. Thank you. So I'll talk a little bit about the entry of foreign nationals to Canada from any country other than the United States. So a foreign national is prohibited from entering Canada from any country other than the United States if they have COVID-19 or have signs and symptoms of COVID-19, which include a fever and cough or a fever and breathing difficulties. They seek to enter for an optional or discretionary purpose. They do not meet one of the exemptions listed in the Order in Council. As Bonnie stated earlier, there are group exemptions to the prohibition under Section 3JII of the Order in Council for persons arriving from any country other than the United States, including persons providing an essential service as determined by the Chief Public Health Officer. At this time, the following class of persons are exempt: technicians or specialists specified by the government, manufacturer, or company as required to inspect, maintain, or repair equipment necessary to support critical infrastructure. And Bonnie had gone over some of the other parts of that, so I'm not going to repeat that. Travelers must be able to comply with the mandatory quarantine as required based on the purpose of entry and the length of their stay. And in addition to those entering for business purposes, the following foreign nationals are prohibited from entering Canada from the United States unless they fall under the category of immediate family. So the entry of foreign nationals to Canada from the United States: a foreign national is prohibited from entering Canada from the United States if, once again, if they have COVID-19 or any signs and symptoms of COVID-19, and if they seek to enter for an optional or discretionary purpose unless they are an immediate family member of the Canadian citizen or permanent resident. So I'll go over a little bit what we consider for the purposes of the OIC, what constitutes an immediate family member. In accordance with Section 3.2 of OIC 16, immediate family members of Canadian citizens and permanent residents of Canada are exempt from the prohibition from entering Canada from the United States for an optional or discretionary purpose if the foreign national intends to enter to be with that immediate family member and can demonstrate the intent to stay in Canada for a period of at least 15 days. So an immediate family member means the foreign national is the spouse or common law partner of the Canadian citizen or permanent resident. The foreign national is a dependent child as defined in Section 2 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations of the Canadian citizen or permanent resident, or the spouse or common law partner. The foreign national is a dependent child as defined in Section 2 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations of a dependent child referred to in paragraph B. The foreign national is the parent or a step parent of the Canadian citizen or permanent resident, or of the spouse or common law partner, or the foreign national is the guardian or tutor of the Canadian citizen or permanent resident. So that's most of the, so travelers must be able to comply with the mandatory quarantine as required based on the purpose of entry and the length of their stay. So that wraps up some of the information that we wanted to present. You know, a lot of that content is some of the official legalese, and I know that that might be a little bit hard to follow as far as that goes. So we're hoping that in the Q&A and some of the questions that we've received, that we have an opportunity to kind of lay some of this stuff out in a little bit more plain language. So I think I'll turn it back to the organizers, and then we'll go through the questions that we received, and then onto any other questions that might be available.
Okay, well, I will pop on here at this point. So thank you very much, Eric and Bonnie. You have some questions we had asked everyone when they were registering for today's event to provide us with questions in order to help prepare you in advance of being flooded with questions. I can see quite a few down in the Q&A, and don't worry, we will get to them. What I do want to remind our participants today is that Eric and Bonnie are representatives of the Canadian Cbsa, Canada Border Services Agency. They are not representatives of CBP or the US equivalent. So many of the questions that they'll be able to answer today relate to entry into Canada. So just keep that one in mind as you're thinking of questions to pose for Bonnie and Eric. So you guys have some Q&A already prepared for us.
Yes, so some of the initial questions that we received from when everybody signed in, we did look into them. We paraphrased them a little bit. So you may have posed a question. It may seem worded a little bit differently. We just took any details out, anything that could identify or was too specific. But the questions that we did receive, we looked to answer. So there's just a couple general comments I want to state before I get to answering the questions. The first one is that being an essential worker or performing an essential service has no bearing on if a person is exempt from quarantine. So they are only exempt if they meet one of the categories under Section 6 of OIC 18, which is a slide we showed earlier, and I believe everybody will be receiving that slide as well. So the quarantine doesn't, essential service or essential worker doesn't equal no quarantine. So that's the biggest thing to take out of all of that. In some cases, the relevant quarantine exemption may appear. It may appear to be technicians or specialists specified by the government, manufacturer, or company who enter Canada as required for the purpose of maintaining, repairing, installing, and inspecting equipment necessary to support critical infrastructure. Are required to provide their service within 14 days of their arrival and be able to provide a reasonable rationale why the service is required prior to the end of a quarantine period. So again, like I stated earlier, the onus falls on the person entering to ensure that all the information that they need an officer to know is all the information being presented. What we often find is that what an employer tells an employee and what an employee tells the officer is not always the same thing. So if there is information that you want to ensure is shared with the Border Services officer, a letter of introduction or a letter from the company is always ideal. And ensure that you speak to your employee directly and say, in this kind of time, you need to provide all the necessary information. Like I stated earlier, more is better at this time. Holding back any kind of details could work against somebody in today's environment, not for somebody in today's environment. Above all, we want to ensure, we mentioned the Cdsa mandate, and one of our mandates is the safety and security of Canadians. And it's important that businesses recognize that the intent of the Order in Council is to minimize the risk and exposure of COVID-19 for Canadian citizens and Canadian residents. While the Government of Canada recognizes there may be an economic cost associated with these orders, public health is of the utmost importance, and the intent of the order must be adhered to. And it is the officer's job to adhere to that order. I know sometimes decisions may appear personal, and if that is the case, it can always be requested that somebody speaks to a superintendent, but know that the officers, first and foremost, are just trying to meet the mandate of the safety and security of all Canadians. So the first question that we have is, do sales or service technicians need to quarantine when they return to Canada? So we're talking about a Canadian who went to the United States or elsewhere to perform a duty, and now they're returning to Canada. So dependent on the nature of work, technicians may be required to quarantine upon return to Canada. Sales functions are not within the category of exemption. So if you are sending someone to the United States for a sales call and they come back, they are going to be required to quarantine because that does not fall under the exemption. To be exempt, workers must meet one of the exemptions listed on the mandatory isolation order. Again, you'll have that document, and I believe we also have links to it later where you guys will be able to see where to find that information. The group exemptions listed by the Chief Public Health Officer do not explicitly cover workers who travel to the US and subsequently return to Canada. So it doesn't explicitly speak to that. At that point, you're just someone returning to Canada. So unless you meet the exemptions, clearly know that there might be some additional questions asked at that point. Please be aware that even if exempted from the quarantine requirement, all asymptomatic people entering Canada are still required to wear an appropriate mask or face covering upon entry into Canada while in transit. And if they are in public settings where physical distancing cannot be maintained, they are required to practice social distancing, avoid contact with vulnerable people, and maintain good hygiene practices, and otherwise respect the intent of the order to minimize the spread of COVID-19 in Canada. So there may be an exemption to the quarantine. And I know we've talked a little bit about the self-monitor. So if you're self-monitoring, also make sure that you just take every precaution around those vulnerable around you to ensure that although you're exempt because you meet the criteria, that there is nothing coming back to your loved ones.
Well, thanks, Bonnie. Question 2, how can we ensure that the CBSA will not place an employee in quarantine upon re-entry to Canada after commissioning a project within the US or Mexico? Is there a way to register our company with the CBSA and place all employees on an exemption list of some sort to prevent that? So travelers engaging in essential work are required to articulate the circumstances of travel to an officer. Just like Bonnie said, it's very important that your employees understand exactly what they went to do and the circumstances of their travel, so they can clearly articulate that to the officer, as the officer is going to use all that information to make a decision. So the officer will either make the determination or refer to the Public Health Agency of Canada to assist in a decision on quarantine. So as far as the Public Health Agency of Canada is concerned, since COVID had started, we had contact information with them, And we were in constant contact with them, discussing the individual particulars of certain situations where we were a little bit unsure if they met certain categories or whether they were required to quarantine. We now have on-site resources with PHAC that's at all of the major locations in Windsor. So that's a valuable resource that we're able to use, and that helps in decision making. And we're able to go with them, to go to them when we have any kind of questions as to that. So CBSA does not pre-vet manifest to support cross-border travel, as it is not the employer industry that dictates the exemption to quarantine. So their travel must fall within one of the exemptions listed in Section 6 of the mandatory isolation order to be exempted. But as we said earlier, and as I think Bonnie said it, if there's any question, or if the traveler feels that the officer is making the incorrect decision, the first step is to always ask to speak to a superintendent, and they can usually take a second look at things and make a decision to make sure whether the correct decision is making. And they'll do that in conjunction with, in collaboration with PHAC. And there are times where, due to the situation or the circumstance, that it will get elevated to the chief level, and then we'll have a look at it. So we all have a common interest in making sure that the regulations are followed, and that people are not inadvertently given isolation or quarantine orders that aren't required. So question 3, if you are crossing to perform essential services, is it suggested to add anything extra to your normal border crossing package visa application? So as Bonnie stated earlier, more is better. I happen to think more is better under all circumstances, but especially during the COVID era. A letter identifying how the employment qualifies as essential may assist the Border Services officer in making a determination on entry. Please be mindful that merely performing an essential service does not automatically mean the workers are exempt from the mandatory quarantine. Travelers need to clearly demonstrate how they meet a category under Section 6 of the mandatory isolation order to be exempt from quarantine requirements.
So question 4 is, we have a Canadian subsidiary in Mississauga where we hold training classes for Canadian customers for their convenience, so they do not have to come to the US for a 1-week training course. These classes are taught by some of our US instructors from our headquarters office in Michigan. We typically prepare international mobility work permit applications. Will these types of crossings be permitted, and how will these situations be handled? So I think this is one of the clear-cut cases where something may be deemed as essential, but probably would not be exempt from quarantine. So the answer is foreign national workers would need to be traveling for essential purposes. Again, you're going to have to demonstrate why the U.S. Trainer is required to come to Canada to perform this training. So as travel for convenience does not exempt anyone from the prohibition on entry. As Eric mentioned earlier, the prohibition on entry, if it's non-essential travel and optional travel, you have to be an immediate family member. So in this situation, you would need to demonstrate why that trainer is required to come to Canada, and it cannot just be for convenience purposes. If allowed to enter, the exemption to quarantine for essential services does not include instructors or trainers, or those who are participating in training. So at that point, the trainers would therefore be required to quarantine for 14 days prior to giving the training. And if it was somebody coming in from the US to receive training, they would be required to quarantine for 14 days prior to receiving the training.
Before Eric starts, I just want to get some clarification from either of you. You've both used the term foreign nationals, and then you've said the points that you're discussing about them. When you are talking about people from outside of Canada or foreign nationals, are you referring to US citizens? Is it different for someone from Mexico or Europe or Asia? Or is it, if they're from outside of Canada, they're all treated and dealt with in this, following the same protocols?
The citizenship of the person or the place of residence of the person isn't what matters. What matters is if they're coming from the United States or if they're coming from a country other than the United States. So where the difference comes in, and we did discuss that a little bit earlier, and the big difference, it is far more limited from those entering Canada from a country other than the United States. When you're coming from the United States, like I said, citizenship doesn't matter. So if it's a Mexican citizen coming from the United States, they fall under the order of those entering Canada from the United States. But anybody trying to enter Canada from a country other than the United States has slightly different regulations and rules. Cool. Okay.
Okay. So question 5, why is there so much discrepancy between border guards? I'm sure everybody would agree that this is not a new phenomenon since COVID. But in speaking about the the COVID era, I guess is a term I'll use. We've come a long way in a short period of time. When we look back to March, and it's really not that long ago, but as far as the COVID timeline is concerned, to many of us it feels like a decade ago, because so much has changed within the 4 or 5 month window since this all began. So at the very beginning of COVID, when the OICs were being issued, they were coming out very quickly. So you would try to disseminate this information to the officers to make sure everybody's on the same page. And there would quickly be an amendment to that OIC, new information coming out. And we're constantly trying to get everybody on the same page with the new information. And it was very difficult to get that, especially a large organization like the Ambassador Bridge has 300 employees, various work schedules. It's very, very difficult to get everybody on the same page immediately. So officers are required to make a release or refer decision based on the information provided by the traveler. So I think that, for the example of say 2 workers went over to the United States and based on the exemptions, they should not have be subject to quarantine or self-isolation. When they return to Canada, they go to different primary booths, and one is told to self-isolate for 14 days and one is told not to. A lot of times that will come back to the articulation of what their purpose of travel was to the U.S. With everything being equal and the same circumstances, it should be a consistent answer. In cases where it's not a consistent answer, and should the traveler have concerns that the actions of the officer is not consistent with policy, once again, it is recommended that the client request to speak with the superintendent on duty. And we can get the ball rolling on trying to rectify the situation. But as I stated, in the early days of COVID, things were changing so quickly that it made our job very difficult. Things are starting to slow down as far as the pace of information change isn't quite as quick. And I think that we're doing a much better job of getting everybody on the same page as far as that goes. So Gina, could I get slide 5, please? So why can't a company easily get in contact with a CBSA official? Why do we need to go to these extremes to have a simple question answered? So should businesses have any questions, they can contact the Border Information Service at the following numbers. So those numbers are all listed for your use. Apologies. So I know that. Actually, Gina, can you go back one? I think that forward one. There we go. Thank you. So that's our business line, and they should be able to answer any questions that you have, or put you into touch with somebody that can give you those answers. So the important thing to know about our Border Information Service is that that all those questions that they receive are tracked. And if we see a common theme on some of the questions that we're getting, that is made aware to senior management within CBSA, and we try to get that information out and try to get everybody on the same page so everybody is aware of the concerns that are being brought to the business line. So I would suggest that everybody use that line, and they will get you in touch with somebody that can answer your questions. So Gina, if we could go on to the to the next slide, please. Yeah. No, it's two back, sorry. Cbsa websites. Perfect, thank you. So why can't the exact guidelines and requirements be provided on the website for easy reference? So as the situation remains quite fluid, the Government of Canada has provided the following link to the public to access the most up-to-date information with respect to the ongoing restrictions due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So those, so the Cbsa website is listed there, as well as some links that businesses can also refer to, the OICs, and yep.
Sorry, I just wanted to pipe in here for a minute. Sue, I believe that you had just mentioned to me about the prohibition of entry versus Canadians versus, from the United States versus non. This will show you that OIC 16 talks about prohibition of entry into Canada from the United States, and OIC 17 shows from any country other than the United States. So that will give everybody a clear guideline if they're looking at somebody coming from the United States or somebody from a country other than the United States.
Thanks, Bonnie. As Bonnie stated, OIC 16 and 17 will deal with that little bit of nuance between where the traveler is coming into Canada from. And OIC 18 will deal with minimizing the risk of exposure to COVID-19 in Canada order, which is the mandatory isolation. So those are good resources to have. And I would suggest that you refer to those and in conjunction with the biz line. Okay, can we get slide 7, Gina, please? Or is that the one that's up? Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so the slide that's up now, that website includes the PHAC contact information for assistance in interpreting any of the orders in council currently in effect, or any additional questions about the emergency order. So as I stated earlier, we are in constant contact with PHAC at the local level, which is the Tullamore Bridge, with our local officials. When there are questions that are received or scenarios that are received that are particularly specific or are difficult to get a proper interpretation on, we do have a task force that will forward those questions to, and they will contact PHAC at the HQ level, and they'll disseminate those answers back down to the local level. So between all of those, they are trying to ensure that the correct interpretation of these OICs and regulations are adhered to.
Okay, so the next question we have is, a company has a large piece of equipment that has been shipped to Detroit and requires as many as 30 employees to attend the site in Detroit to assist an entire team of technicians, etc., who have specialized knowledge and skills related to the equipment. This work may take as long as 1 month. What would the best procedure for the employees to conduct this work be? For example, cross on a daily basis so as to limit their exposure to the public and keep themselves contained to the work site only, or to stay for a longer period of time in the Detroit area over 30 days. So I have, opinions on this as to what might be ideal, but I think what may be ideal from a employer perspective, as you'll see from my answer, may not be ideal from an employee perspective. So I think that's one of the things that has to be considered in a scenario such as this. So the quarantine exemptions would only apply if the travelers met any of the exemptions listed in the mandatory isolation order. Based on the circumstances laid out in the scenario, there does not appear to be any exemption for the team of technicians. And as such, they would be subject to the 14-day mandatory quarantine, whether returning each day or after a longer period of time of a month or more. So it gets a little bit technical here, but I want to make sure everybody understands that while workers may leave Canada prior to the expiration of their 14-day of quarantine, that quarantine period begins again every time they re-enter Canada. So if you decide to have people go back and forth every day, and from an employer perspective, that may be ideal when you're talking hotels and things like that. Every day that the employee returns to Canada, they're under mandatory quarantine. And they can leave Canada in that period of time, but every time they return to Canada, they return back to the quarantine start date of 14 days. So if you were to give people 5 days in the United States and 5 days home, their entire 5 days home would be quarantined every single time they returned until they met that 14-day period. So that's something to consider in this scenario. That being said, and Gina, if you could put up slide 7 one more time. This is a situation where I would recommend that you send the question to PHAC. And at the very bottom there, it just says if you require assistance in interpreting the orders in council, or if you have additional questions about the emergency order, direct your inquiry to, and it's phac.emergencyorder-French. Sorry, I'm not French. And then COVID-19, and it's an email. You can send a question directly to them. And at that point, there may be consideration given to your situation. So this is the exact kind of time and exact kind of situation where contacting PHAC directly and seeking that information might be to your benefit, because you have a lot of employees doing this work over a long period of time.
So I have a question, but I also have a statement. We're out of time. I'm keeping an eye on the clock here. Now it just rolled over. It's 26 minutes after 12. We're to draw this to a close at 12:30, and you and Eric were so organized that you had all of the advanced questions nailed down, all of the responses. It's so very appreciated. But while you were talking, we had 50 questions come in. So I really don't have a job to do at this point. I'm looking at all of the questions, and you've answered some of them, because some of the questions came in earlier before you went into detail. Some of them refer to things that we took just absolutely for granted prior to the COVID crisis. One of the questions was, hey, I need to go get my mail in the US for the US business office I have over there. What am I going to do about that? Do I have to quarantine? And, something that we thought nothing of previously. Now clearly.
And the answer to that is yes.
Yes, you have to quarantine. Yeah.
Yes.
And so clearly these are things that we have to give deeper thought to. But our very last question, that I see anyway in the Q&A box is it possible to get a predetermination from CBSA? In other words, I guess we've got two players here. We've got public health and CBSA, but who can we as businesses talk to in advance to say, here's the scenario that we're thinking of. We'd like to go get our mail, and here's how we're doing it. What do you say about that? Please.
So I guess,
what can we do?
I guess there's no real easy answer there. So if you're asking about a Canadian coming to, or a foreign national coming to Canada to perform work, so we'll go there. CBSA is going to determine admissibility and whether or not they deem the work to be essential. Public health determines whether or not quarantine is required. So if you're talking about picking up mail in the United States, or somebody who goes to the United States for a reason that's deemed not essential or optional, then it's public health that's making the quarantine decision. CBSA officers are interpreting the orders in council, and CBSA officers are acting on the information in those orders in council. But the ultimate decision maker, should there be a discrepancy, would always be public health and the quarantine officer. Like Eric stated earlier, we do have screening officers on site a couple hours a day as well. So unfortunately, it is a little bit murky in that department, but quarantine decisions will be public health. Essential, is this essential travel, all that falls to CBSA.
Okay. And so we can use the resources, the links and information and numbers that
Yes.
you've given us to reach out. So
Yes.
I think for many people that will take care of the anxiety when we're looking at sending our employees stateside or down to Mexico and then successfully bringing them back. That will help all of us deal with it. And you said something earlier before we started. We had a bit of time before the webinar just to kind of get ourselves prepared, as every good webinar practitioner does. But you said the days of less, well, how did you say? Less is
The days
more.
of less and more are over.
It's over.
It's true. It's over.
Now it's about being fully prepared with your information package. You've got to show and answer all of the questions, including, is this essential or non-essential? And now we have to take the public health guidelines into consideration. So
yes, and I would just like to say the
is not
officers
better.
are doing
More
their
is better.
best.
Yeah.
The officers are doing their best. They are trying to really analyze the information, but their jobs have also completely changed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a big change for everyone.
Yeah. Okay. So now we really are out of time, and I'm going to turn my camera and microphone off, and I'm going to hand it over to Richard Janik from CTMA, who's going to take the session out to close.
On behalf of our co-moderators, Mike Bilton and Shelley Fellows, and of course, Susan Anzelin, who's at the helm of this effort, we sincerely thank each of you for providing the clarity on the current regulations and the resources in order for the manufacturing community to undertake best practices for our cross-border business travels. Additionally, we would like to thank the sponsors of this webinar, WindsorEssex Development Corporation, Canadian Association of Mold Makers, CAM, Automate Canada, Canadian Tooling and Machining Association, CTMA, and Consulate General of Canada, Detroit. And to all of you in attendance, thank you for taking the time to submit your questions, and trust that the information presented will assist you in successful cross-border business travel going forward.